Kia ora everyone. For our conclusion to our exile theme today, we are looking at the phrase the Son of Man found in Daniel. And this term is particularly important. It is a title that Jesus most often refers to when describing himself, particularly in Mark. And before we get into all of that, I thought we'd just go over another overarching theme that is particularly relevant for today's topic, but also has been hovering over our whole sort of Old Testament exile investigation, and that is the difference in scriptural understanding between Western and Eastern thought. And this was kind of highlighted by Rose last week, who commented at the end of the service about how different a lot of this teaching was to what she had heard in church growing up. And she also mentioned the podcast that she was listening to called the Beamer Discipleship Podcast. And so I listened to a few of these episodes, and they are doing something very similar to our friends at the Bible Project, where they describe their work as a walk through the context of the Bible and the text itself, as well as the surrounding history. They are deconstructing our common readings of the Bible and attempting to reconstruct them through the lens of historical context. And this context is, of course, Eastern. And it is quite different than the West in that it describes truth not so much with facts as history and definitions, but through story and multi-layered symbols, or the deep truth you find in art. And this definition of the Old Testament as a huge multi-layered artwork created over centuries by generations of people attempting to describe their relationship with the divine is, for me, a far more approachable way of understanding all these strange stories. And these two ways of understanding Scripture have been developing independently for hundreds of years, and it is only fairly recently that their paths have started to collide. And this other way of reading Scripture has been known in scholarly theological circles for 30 years or so in the West, and is only now just starting to be filtered out or relayed in easily understandable forms by the work being done by people like the Beamer Podcast or the Bible Project. And so, with all this in mind, and as familiar as the term is for many of us growing up, the term the Son of Man is a title that scholars now recognize would have had a very different meaning for the Jews around this whole period. And so recently a lot has been written about this term as scholars look at the verses in Daniel 7 and try to understand just what those around him thought he meant when he said this. If we look at the surface view of Daniel 7, we see very similar picture to what we saw in some of the other Old Testament creation poetry about God taming or defeating strange sea monsters. We read in Daniel 7, 2-3, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. In Daniel 7, 7-18, and as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him, to be given dominion and glory and kingship, that all the peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Now, the imagery of Daniel 7 is mostly understood to at least be an expression of hope for Israel in the future, where the heavenly realms show triumph over all the neighboring principalities. And it's kind of a reversal of the grim reality of the downtrodden, long-suffering Hebrews below. But what exactly does the figure represent? And there have traditionally been four interpretations. And the first is the most common interpretation in the West, and it has been for a long time, that of a long hoped for Messiah figure based on a kingly figure like David. However, although this is still popular in some circles, it has now fallen out of favour amongst the majority of scholars who believe it is not how Son of Man would have been interpreted back then. For many of the Jews at this time, it was perceived mostly to be probably Michael the Archangel, the great prince and the protector of the Hebrew people. This is the same figure who would have been seen in Daniel 3:25 as the fourth figure who protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Michael is mentioned in Daniel 10 in the context of doing war against the princes of the very nations the mysterious beasts are alleged to represent, and in Daniel 12 he seems to be seen as an ultimate deliverer. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. ... Now, other scholars argue that in the context of the time it was written, the Son of Man figure is a representation of the whole of Israel. This theme of the book of Daniel is set in the context of an oppressed people in exile, struggling to remain true to their God, with the hope that in doing so they will be restored. And this is what happens in the vision. Whether the representation is symbolic or metaphysical, there is general consensus that the beasts represent the four kingdoms of Babylon, Media, Persia, and finally Greece. So that's the third argument. And the final argument is that of a priestly identity. There was a belief in a tradition of a semi-divine mediatorial figure or figures stretching back through Israel's history, including Adam, Enoch, Noah, and Melchizedek. The Son of Man coming in the clouds references the high priest coming in the clouds of incense into the Holy of Holies, where God is seated and the high priest sits by his side. So this would have been in the temple as a bulwark to all the chaos that is going on around in the surrounding kingdoms. If this vision is correct, it would also explain the real animosity shown to Jesus by the high priest in Mark 14. The importance of Jesus claiming a priestly role are obvious and make up the most foundational claims of Christianity, his ability to forgive sins. And so, as we wrap this topic up, we are going to look at some of the conclusions of N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright is one of the world's leading Bible scholars and is or was a former bishop of Durham in the Church of England. And a lot of the ideas from this exile theme that we have been examining come from his writing and from his ideas. And they also feature hugely in the Bible Project. And so N.T. Wright warns against flattening out the symbolic visionary literature and claims that, like a lot of the symbols and stories we see in the Bible, they are best understood as a hybrid of various meanings. In this way, over-reliance on certain aspects are avoided, along with the tunnel vision that biblical scholarship has been guilty of for many, many decades. And so for Wright, he would interpret the Son of Man figure for the Jews over the Hellenistic period and Roman periods as a composite or a divine figure who is also representative of his people and who forgives sins and transforms the chaotic nature of people and challenges the monstrous institutions around him. And once again, this is portrayed beautifully by our friends at the Bible Project with their interpretation of the term the Son of Man in this little video.